Well, hello everyone. I hope you're doing well. Regret that we've had to go back to this way of meeting on Sunday, but anyhow, I wanted to provide you with some thoughts for this Sunday morning, or well, I guess whenever you're watching it, but hopefully Sunday morning. This will be a good opportunity for you. So anyhow, I guess quick little update. I am slowly feeling better. One thing to, I guess, watch today is I can still feel a little bit of mind fog, I guess is how I would describe it. So if I seem a little out of it today or not really, I don't know, too perky or kind of slow, it's because I have to think a little extra hard. I don't know, things don't come as quickly to me right now. I'm sure that'll pass as continue to get better. But anyway, this reading today comes from Matthew 15. Matthew 15 and beginning in verse 1. So that's where I'm going to read from. So let me read that to you, and you're welcome to follow along, and then we'll make some observations. In fact, there'll be more than one lesson that will come out of this passage, but anyhow, so you can be reading it again through the week if you like for a week from Sunday. Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat." Jesus replied, "And why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is devoted to God, they are not to honor their father or mother with it. Thus you nullify the word of God for the sake of your traditions. You hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them." Then the disciples came to him and asked, "Don't you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this?" Jesus replied, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them. They are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit." And again, that's from Matthew 15. So let's make a few observations and maybe unpack this passage a little bit. But if you'll notice, first of all, these teachers of the law and Pharisees come to Jesus from Jerusalem. Now, at this time, he is in Galilee. He's on the Sea of Galilee, a place called Gennesaret, kind of on the northwest corner. And the point I'm wanting to make there is that this is roughly, I think, ballpark, a distance of about 70 miles. And it could have been a little bit longer trip if from their way, in other words, Jerusalem's down south of where Jesus currently is in the story. And so a lot of times the Jews, when they would travel, say, from Jerusalem up to the Galilee area, they might actually hang a right and go around the Samaritan area, because Samaria lies between Galilee and Jerusalem, or Judah, that southern part. And sometimes they wouldn't travel through the Samaritan area, and they would actually go around. So it could have been a little more. It's not really important overall, just pointing out that these guys have purposely traveled out of their way to come see Jesus. This is not happenstance that they've run into him. And probably this is some kind of a delegation. You notice the plurals there, Pharisees, teachers of the law. These are some that have gone out of their way to probably seek Jesus out and question him on some things. Because apparently there have been some, problems in their minds about this washing of hands. Now, this is something that's hard for us to wrap our minds around. We don't really practice it or think of it in this way, but this is not really so much about hygiene. I know with this year of 2020 with the COVID and all of that, there's been a big emphasis on that. Everybody wash your hands, and so there's been a renewed emphasis on that. But this is not really a hygiene issue. That's not what they're thinking of. For the Jews, there were things that if you were to touch or come in contact with could make you unclean. In other words, this is about, I guess I would call it a ceremonial cleanness, being ceremonially clean to come in, to come into worship or to eat or to do whatever you want to do. And so it's really kind of their way of making sure that they are ceremonially clean. And there were even these, we've got evidence today of them, they call them mikvahs. There's all kinds of speculation about these mikvahs. They may have been early baptistries, but it would be something where the Jews, maybe before they would go into the temple or into something to make themselves ceremonially clean, you'd actually go down into it. It would be big enough for you to go down into and then come out of, and then you would be washed and ceremonially clean that way. But in other words, there's some sort of this is really more of a religious ritual. This is not about hygiene. It's a religious ritual to say, I'm making myself clean before I eat or before I approach God or this type of thing. So if that'll help a little bit, this is not about hygiene issues. This is about a religious ritual that helps to make them clean and that sort of thing. So, and of course, you know, there's probably lots here we could talk about. This part of the idea here is that this is where Jesus talks about it's not what goes into your mouth that makes you unclean, it's what comes out and that sort of thing. And we'll talk about that more later. That's not the primary focus of today. You know, this is one of those places, I believe it's in Mark, the same episode in Mark, this is a place where Jesus even declares all food's clean. It's not what goes into your mouth that matters. It's what comes out of your mouth. And like I say, I could camp there for a while and talk about that because people that think they're so religious but yet still do so much damage with their mouth. It's not really what goes in. So we're getting into some stuff here it's very Jewish. It's hard for us to understand because we don't typically practice it. But this is about ritual cleanness. This is about being clean ritually, not hygienically. Okay, so it's a purity question. Now, I always want to try and take time whenever we come across passages like this. Very often for us, there's an initial reaction to just always make the Pharisees bad guys. And I want to try and point out that there's good intentions behind what they're doing. There's good intentions behind what the Pharisees are trying to do. In other words, God has given guidelines in what we would call the Old Testament. So he's given these guidelines about what people are to do. And there were all these things that the Jews had about like these cleanliness laws and dietary laws and the Sabbath, and there's all sorts of things there that the Jews had. And so they want to honor those. But very often, questions come up about how do we honor it? You know, what do we do here? That sort of thing. And so one of the things that you see happens is, and again, it's well-intentioned, is that people will take very strict views sometimes on things. Very, very strict views about, okay, we're going to honor God, we're going to do all this kind of stuff. And so they take this very strict view. And one of the realities is sometimes with strict views, they can just go a little bit overboard and they can really lose the intent of what God wanted, you know. So God's ancient intent in giving something maybe end up being corrupted because we just go too far with it and we can take things too far. And so, and this is familiar with us in our own way, in our own culture today. There are times when a law may be written with a very good intent, but it ends up having unintended consequences. Things come out of it we didn't mean or whatever, and it's just because of the way it gets interpreted or taken. So, but I do want to get the idea across that, first of all, these guys mean well. It's meant well, and especially the origins of this. This has obviously become a tradition of the elders, but this is something that was meant well. It was intended to be a good thing, okay? So let's keep that in mind for a moment. It's not that these guys have ill intent. They really want to try and do what's right. But as you're going to see as we move through this, sometimes in trying to do what's right, we can get caught up in our own little worlds and we can forget about what's really important. And we can get caught up with all these traditions and things of that nature. So in other words, sometimes you see people, they just end up getting too picky. At least that's the way I would express it. They just end up getting too picky on things. And they can get so picky and they can lose sight of the big things. And that's what Jesus is pointing out here. I mean, it's kind of in a sense, I think I can kind of almost sense the amazement on Jesus' part. You guys made this trip all the way up here to ask me about hand washing. Really? This is what you walked all this way to do. And this is probably a several day trip. And then you got to get there and find where Jesus is. And This is what you guys want to talk about. And then see, Jesus goes on to point out they just don't see the contradiction within themselves, because this is a tradition of men. Jesus points out that God said, honor your father and mother. Folks, that's in the 10 Commandments. That's a big deal there. Honor your father and mother. And I have to point out, this honoring your father and mother is a much bigger idea than obedience to parents. I know that parents a lot of times will say to their kids, honor your father and mother, which means you got to obey us. Yes, that idea is there of obedience to parents. But the real intent behind that command is make sure that your parents are taken care of. There's going to come a time, if your parents live long enough, there's going to come a time in their life when their care will end up falling to you. And you have to make sure that they are taken care of. That's how you honor your father and your mother. That's really kind of the ultimate thing that means, is you honor your father and your mother, okay? And that's the real intent behind this. And so there's this traditions, there's this things we don't understand, is that somebody may make a commitment of some of their resources or money or whatever. They may make a commitment and say, I dedicate this to God. Okay, again, the intent there is good. But then they may find themselves in a situation where, you know what, I need that to be able to help my parents. Well, what the Pharisees were saying is, you gave it to God. That's irreversible. No, you can't take that back. And Jesus is saying, you know what, you guys ought to give that back. That ought to be given back to this man so he can take care of his parents. That's more important. I mean, if you really get down to it, does God need our money? Does he need it? I mean, he doesn't. Everything belongs to him. He doesn't need our money. And so people would make this dedication to the Lord of a piece of property or money or whatever type of a resource it was. But then if they needed that resource back to be able to take care of their parents, it wasn't available to them anymore. No, it was, I'm sorry, you gave it, we're done. And so Jesus is chewing them out on that. He's saying, you walked all the way up here to talk to me about this when you tell people this other thing that only hurts people, and it only ends up hurting the parents. So you can kind of see why Jesus is, I suspect there's some indignation and maybe a little anger in his voice in this exchange. This is what you guys walked all the way to talk about. Really, this is what you want to talk about. So that kind of unpacks the passage for us a little bit. And what I want to do is I want to challenge us to think in terms of, do we get caught up in our own traditions and our own ways of thinking that it's hard for us to see and to realize what's might be a bigger or more important issue? And let's unpack that a little bit and talk about it. One of the things that we've got to realize is that we've got to have ways to evaluate ourselves and what we really think about things. In other words, there's times in life where you're going to have to take a stand on something, one way or the other. What you believe is probably going to get challenged at some point in time in your life, some way or another. So you've got to figure out what you're going to do with that. And one of the things that I've learned is that if you've been taught something ever since you were little bitty, and especially if it's in a religious context like church, or in their case, they're the Jewish religion, whatever. If you've been taught something ever since you were little bitty, it's hard to give that up. That's a hard thing to give up and let go of. It's tough. If you've been told something enough times, it's hard to let go of it. And especially if your family really does live by it and has to sacrifice by this tradition or by this rule. That's a hard thing to give up. And you know what? It may be something that needs to be given up. Maybe it's something that's not all that important. But yet it's hard to do. If you've been told something your whole life, it's really buried deep inside us that that's the way things are. And so that's one of the things that makes it hard to unearth these type of things. And we need to realize that, you know what, there's probably some things that we've been told in life that aren't right. That just aren't right. And to keep this where it doesn't get controversial today, let me just give you a whole different type of example. Growing up, I'd always been told that the days are longer in summer. And then I ended up going to, when I went to college, I had to take a science class. And so I ended up taking one called astronomy. And I figured something out, that thing I'd been told my whole life and believed was not true. Now, if I don't get the dates exactly right, I'm sorry, it's been a while. But it seems to me like, I think it's June 21st is the first day of summer. And the first day of summer is marked because that's the longest day of the year. That's when you have the most daylight. The sun rises and sets. It's the most time that the sun's up. Okay, it's the longest day of the year. Well, immediately after, and that's the beginning of summer. Well, immediately after June 21st, all the days start getting shorter. Now, it may only be, I forget now if it's 30 seconds or 40 minutes. I don't remember. It's been too long. But the principle is there that in summer, the days get shorter. They don't get longer, you see. The reality is, see, it's December, I think it's December 21st. That's when we mark the beginning of winter. See, it's winter and spring when the days are getting longer. And then that winter and spring days culminate in June 21st. So, and again, this is not a big deal. That's why I said I want to pick one that's not, hugely controversial to get everybody stirred up, because I don't like doing that in a video situation because you can't respond or ask questions. So I just want to give you something that I've just grown up my whole life saying, hey, the days are longer in summer. No, they're not. The days are getting shorter in the summer. Once you have summer begin, the days are getting shorter. And so I just throw that out there as something because it's there. It's something that was burned into me. And taking that astronomy course, it helped me to realize, oh, this is how we do this. So anyhow, so just be open to the idea that there may be some things that we've been told and that we believe deep down inside that, you know what, it's either a tradition, it's not a command of God, or it's something that might even just not be true. We need to keep that idea open. Now, let me give you another principle, and this is one that's not hard and fast because I can give you this principle and I can talk about it two ways, how it works and how it doesn't always work. So, and for the sake of time, I don't have time to go into a lot of examples, but one of the things I do sometimes with myself, if I'm questioning myself about something, and I'm coming at it from a Christian perspective, we're talking about something that's maybe Christian doctrine or what I think is Christian doctrine or whatever, I've learned to ask myself this: let's take a complete outsider, somebody that's not a believer. How would they look at my view on this? Is this something they would say, even if they don't agree with it, would they say, you know what, I can see how if you're going to be a Christian, it's fundamental that you believe that. But here's the thing, there are times when you see Christians hang on to something and would just be almost willing to fight you to the death for it, that an outsider is going to look at and go, those people are just crazy. Those people are just crazy. This is what they're hung up on. This is what they're hung up on. This is not good. And I hope that one makes a little bit of sense. And I'm not saying it's foolproof. There are times where I can think of examples where this wouldn't work, but I can think of a lot of examples that would be really helpful to people if they could look around for a moment and go, you know what? To an outsider, this looks completely stupid. Why am I pushing and promoting this and hanging on to it so very hard? So I just want to throw that one out there. Another way to evaluate ourselves is we got to be careful with slippery slope arguments. If you're familiar with that term, great. If you're not, let me take a moment and explain it. A slippery slope argument is a situation where you say, well, whatever it is we're talking about may not be wrong, but I think it's going to lead to this. And so you say it's a slippery slope. In other words, if you get too close to the edge, the edge of the slope is slippery and you suddenly wind down at the bottom. And it's one of those arguments you hear people use a lot of times, say, well, if we do this, it's going to lead to that. And again, it's not foolproof. There are times when a slippery slope argument may make some sense. It may be worth saying, hey, we want to be real cautious about the precedent we set here. But there's other times when that's crazy too. Doing this is not going to lead to this. It's not going to go there. It's not going to happen. And so I think that's one thing that I've always tried to evaluate myself in terms of too. Am I just using a slippery slope argument? That's why am I hanging on to this simply because it's slippery slope? And I've seen that lots of times in myself and in others where they're just hanging on to something simply because they're afraid. They don't think whatever it is wrong, but they're afraid of where it could lead down the road. And so we want to be careful about those type of things. Because again, I can see this with the Pharisees. Maybe they'd be willing to realize, well, okay, this hand washing stuff is just a tradition, all that. But if we throw this one out, where does it end? Where are you going to stop this thing? Where's your, so I can see how that works. Now, let me say this too. This does not mean that traditions are bad. This does not mean traditions are bad. We've all got traditions, whether it's in our family or whether it's within churches. And traditions can be good things. They can be things that are worth hanging on to and to doing. Okay. So I don't want to make it sound like it's just because something's a tradition, we shouldn't do it. It's that when the tradition sets aside, as Jesus says, a command of God, When a tradition sets aside a command of God, or to put it another way, well, here's one of the ways I express it or think of it, is when a tradition ends up hurting people instead of helping them. You see, one of the things that I noticed time and time again as I've looked at Jesus, and I have not yet found an exception to this, so I'm becoming convinced in my mind that it really is true. You really want to make Jesus angry? Put policy over people. Start thinking in terms of, well, this is our policy. I'm sorry, we've got this policy. And because this is our policy, I'm sorry, we can't help you. I realize you've got an exceptional case and we should probably do something here, but I'm sorry, this is our policy. That's when you start to see, I think, Jesus get angry. I think you can start to see the steam come out of his ears. The rules are not there to hurt people. Rules are there to help people. The commands that God gives are there to help. And when you set them aside or you come up with some tradition that ends up hurting people instead of helping them, that's where the problem really comes in. That's where it really becomes an issue. And you see what? You see, sometimes we can get caught up in a little world, in our own little world, in our own little way of doing things and thinking about things. And when we get caught up there and we find ourselves there, you know what? It's really amazing how we can find ourselves defending some pretty kind of silly things. We can end up defending some silly things that don't make sense, that aren't helpful. We really do. We like to create our own little worlds. We like to create our own little worlds that we're comfortable in, and we like that world to stay comfortable. And we don't like somebody coming in and poking it or rattling it a little bit. And it can make us very defensive. And so we've got to be careful with ourselves in that way. In other words, I've just seen the times where people get really upset over little things, and the big things just don't seem to bother them. They get upset over little things, and the big things don't seem to bother them. In other words, here's the best example I can think of. And this is a story, and I've told this story before. It's not unique to me. I think I read it years ago in a magazine. It was anyway. But I think it helps to illustrate the point. And there's some people don't like this story. I've caught flack over telling this story before. So send me an email, I guess. But the story goes like this. It was a missionary, and he had come into a congregation. He was doing a report on the country where he was. And it was a situation in this particular country where they were having a famine, and there was a lot of tough things happening in that country, just in the lives of people trying to live their lives and make their lives work. It was just a very tough time. And because of this going on, there were, I forget how many, people would even just starve to death in this country. It was really a tough time. And so he's walking through this. And the people are sitting there politely listening and all of that. And so he kind of feels some frustration growing in him. And he makes this comment. And again, this is in a church setting, so you can see why this would upset people. He goes, and you know what? The sad thing is, you folks don't give and then he uses a nice little 4-letter word. And he said, you know what's even sadder than that? Is that you're going to go home tonight complaining that I used a 4-letter obscenity, and you're not going to be the least bit upset that tonight in that country, 25 children will die of hunger. Now, folks, am I making a case for using obscenity in church? No, please don't hear it that way. I beg you don't hear it that way. I don't want to hear any complaints about that. But do you get the missionary's overall point? Isn't it amazing how if something seems so far removed from us and it's just not a part of us, we don't get upset? We don't feel that frustration, that anger of, wait a minute, these children are dying, people are dying, there's something we could do. We just seem to be very happy and content the way we are. And I think that's what he was trying to bring out with that story. I think it's all he was trying to do is to cause them to pause and think for a moment. Why is it I'm more upset about a word that got uttered in church than I am about the fact that people are dying somewhere else, you see? So that's what I'm getting at. When Jesus says, you guys walked all this way to talk to me about this, there are people that need taken care of. You have it within your power to see that they're taken care of, and you won't do anything about that. But you want to talk about washing hands. It's a tense. This is not a fun little interview that they've had with each other. So anyhow, I guess what I'm saying is when I look at this passage, it always reminds me that, I need to be praying and I need to say, Lord, open my eyes to what it is that I'm not seeing that I need to see. Lord, open our eyes to see what's really important and to take our stand on that and not on silly things. All right. I hope your week goes well. I appreciate your taking the time to watch this, and may God bless you. And if you're well, stay well. And if you've been sick, I pray you get well soon. Take care.